Hello and welcome to my Vray 3 for Rhino 6 tutorial on creating and mapping materials. So this tutorial is intended for using Vray 3 for Rhino 6, and this tutorial is sort of a continuation of using some particular settings that I've developed that are very much built for architects specifically. As we know, Vray is designed for a lot of different professions, but what I've tried to do is find ways that make it work best for architecture. So if you haven't watched the settings tutorial as well as the lighting tutorial, go ahead and jump to those just to get up to speed with where we are. So now let's jump in and create some great materials for our little sample house here. So a couple high-level things. Vray is a powerful program, obviously, but what really makes it great is the power of all of this is really in creating good materials. So no matter how great your lighting is in your settings, if your materials aren't calibrated to sort of reflect realistic materials, you're never going to get a great output. So creating good materials is extremely important. Luckily, there are a lot of free materials you can find online, and Vray itself comes with a lot of materials. So let's just start there, and then we'll move on to creating some materials from scratch, which I find is the best way to get exactly what you want, to create the look you want. And then we'll go through the settings and figure out the nuances within each one. So in our Vray asset editor, if we go to the materials section here, we can see we sort of are starting off blank. If I hit this left arrow to pull out more options here, what we have are all of the materials that Vray gives you. To be honest with you, some of these are better than others. It's great that they have a huge library built into the program now. They didn't always have that. But some of them are not great, and some of them are pretty solid. So I've had a chance to run through and test almost all of them, and I don't want to get into all of them at the time right now. I can let you all sort of see for yourself which ones are your favorites. But I do want to just jump into one that I like, and we'll use that to get rolling. So let's actually start with so if we look at our landscape out here, we have a lot of ground. Let's just get that covered real quick. And so if I go to the ground and I scroll through here, these grass materials are pretty decent as a way to just sort of, cover large swaths of grass. In reality, what I would do is sort of use that as a baseline and then come back in Photoshop and really bring in individual trees and bushes and things like that, but it's easier to Photoshop onto a already rendered surface. So to bring in a preset Vray material, all you need to do is click and drag it over. So now we have a grass material in here. The other one I want to pull in is a concrete material. We'll use this as our foundation. So if you look at these concrete materials, and also a little trick, if you slide this slider over, you can get a little bit better view before you pick the concrete you want. So they have some pretty good concrete floors here. What I actually want is just the concrete for our foundation. So this concrete simple B01 is probably a good way to start. So I'm going to slide that over as well. So you'll notice that these concrete names B01 2M, and so that stands for 2 meters. So that'll be important for scaling it, and we'll come back to that in a bit. So we have the concrete in there, and we have the grass. So let's go ahead and actually start applying these to some materials and see how we're doing. And if you're joining us from the previous lighting tutorial, it's important to note that I'm going to go back and turn my material override off. Again, that was something we turned on to help speed up the lighting settings. I'm going to make sure that's off now because now we're dealing with materials and we want to see how they render. So I have a grass and a concrete. I'm going to minimize this. So what I've found over the years is the best way to stay organized with your materials and to get them attributed to the proper surfaces in Rhino is to just attribute them to an entire layer. So it's a little bit of a fundamental way that I organize my layers is almost by what the material that they're going to be in reality. So if we go to this environment drop down in mine, I have this terrain here. If you go to the right here, under there's like a material drop down, you can see that there's these really faint circles. They're all empty right now because I don't have any material sets. If I just click in that area there, it brings up a dialog box and it just says default material white. I'm going to go to the drop down and I'm going to go to this use plugin Vray for Rhino. When I click here, now it goes to a different drop down and it's not finding anything, so I'll hit browse, goes to yet another drop down, and then I can find that grass texture that I brought in. So then I'll click OK, OK, and OK. So now if I view this in rendered mode, you can see that that grass has come in all over my landscape here. So the next thing we want to focus on is the scale. So if we go back to that material itself and we see this 200 centimeters, that's going to tell us what the scale of this grass should be. So right when you bring a material in, it comes in at whatever scale the surface that you're applying it to. So it sort of maps it out and stretches it however it wants. So if we click on that surface itself, we can change what that is by simply going to the texture mapping in your properties toolbar. And if we go to there, first thing I'm going to do actually is just hit delete mapping. There was in a previous version of this tutorial, it was already set up here, so I'm going to delete it, so we're kind of coming in scratch. And now we can see that this grass looks very, very much out of scale, right? It looks huge, and that's because it's mapping that whole, our little picture of grass, it's mapping it over the whole area. And so what we want to do is control that scale so that it's much, much smaller. And we know by Vray has told us that it's 200 centimeters. So I'm going to select that object again, and I'm going to go over here. There's a lot of different mapping methods. 90% of all mapping can be done with the box mapping. It's a simple way of mapping things from left, right, up, and down, and it works on almost all objects except for maybe cylinders or spheres and things like that. But when it comes to architecture, most things are flat and orthogonal, so we can just map them top down, left, right. So I'll hit apply box mapping, and you can see up here right now it wants to apply a first corner. So I'm basically making a bounding box, which is going to sort of define how big it is. So this can also go anywhere. So I'm just going to click here, and my project is actually in inches, not centimeters, but I know that 200 centimeters is about 78 inches. So I'm just going to type in 78, enter, 78, enter, so length and width is 78. And for height, I'll just also do 78. It shouldn't matter that much because it's a flat surface. Enter, and the last thing, do you want your box capped? And we just hit yes, because we do. And now that scale of that grass is made much, much smaller. And this starts to look, when you really zoom in, it's a little funny, but when you zoom out, it's about the scale of a nice fuzzy grass there. So let's go ahead and do that same thing for our foundation. So I have that on a concrete layer here. Again, my layers are by what the material is going to be. I'll click on the right side, drop down, use the plugin, go to browse, another drop down, go to my concrete, click OK, and click OK. And so now you can see that foundation has come in here as a concrete layer. But again, I want to make sure that it's at the right scale. So again, there was sort of a previous scale left over in this model. So to make sure that everything's working together, what I'll do is I'll just select one surface here, and I'll delete the mapping. So now you can see sort of the default in here. And I'll apply a box mapping to my one surface. And for this one, I'll just use I'll snap to a corner of the piece I'm working on. So again, 2 meters, it's about 6 feet, we'll say. So I'll do 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet, enter again, and now that scale looks right. And just to be sure that everything on that layer is on that, I'll go to that concrete layer and right click and go to select objects. So now I've selected everything, and you can see the the ceiling of, or the roof of this model is also concrete. Now I have everything that's concrete in my file selected. And now I'll just hit match mapping. So it's this little paintbrush tool here in my texture mapping area. And once everything goes away, and I'll click this exterior piece that I set up originally. I click that, and now everything matched. And if you caught it there, this texture of this middle piece shifted to make sure that it's matching. So now everything's the correct scale, and it's all even because all of my concrete should be scaled together. So now we can see we start to have a little bit of a few materials here at the bottom. Let's do a quick render to, well, let's hold on a second actually. Let's add a few more materials, and then we'll do a quick render to see how those are coming out and seeing what they're doing. So again, at this point we've only brought in V-Ray materials. And so each of these materials has a lot of their own settings about the reflection level, the refraction. I'm going to get into what all these mean, but when I do it, I'm going to get into it for a material that we're going to make for scratch, so I think it'll be a little bit more clear on why we're adjusting these. So we're going to take that V-Ray has sorted out all of these textures for us, and we'll take their word on it that they're going to turn out okay. Another way of getting materials is just to import them, that you may find them as separate the VR mat files. If you are able to find websites, a lot of them will give them away free, including a lot of good architectural websites that have pre-made materials that their file name is a .vrmat. So I'm going to show you how to import those if you have one. So one that I always like to import because it's a tricky material is a glass that I like. So I'm going to import, and I'm going to go, I have it saved here as residential glass. All you have to do is click on it, click open, it comes in here, all the settings are ready to go. So that's going to be an important one. Once I import the material, the first thing I need to do is actually go to my glass layer and attribute all of my glass to that material. So drop down, go to V-Ray, browse, drop down my glass material, click OK, and now you can see my glass is transparent. The great thing about glass is because I'm not mapping a actual JPEG, I don't need to do any scale adjustments like I had to do for the grass and for the concrete. So now that's come in there. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at what's happening now. I think it'll help us prepare for the next material that we're going to make. So I'm going to go back to that main perspective, and we'll just hit render real quick and see how we're doing so far. You can see where we left off from the lighting tutorial of everything kind of being overwritten as just a light gray. But now we have some real grass and we have some real concrete. All right, so what we see here is that all of our elements that we don't have set to a V-Ray material are coming out very, very just white. Our grass is coming out as just a nice subtle grass, and what you can see here is you can start to see where the pattern repeats a little bit. Like I said, the V-Ray given materials are not perfectly seamless, which is a little bit of a shame that they don't come out as seamless as you'd like. But for most times it's not that noticeable, and you can see our concrete in here looks all right. Because it's in shadow, it's a little bit grainy at the moment, and also I'm rendering again, if I look at my settings here, I'm rendering very low settings for time's sake, low quality and small, so I'm not going to be get to see all the nuances. I'll kick that up a bit when we are trying to look at some subtle nuances on materials we're making here in a bit. But, and of course our glass is back in here and has a nice reflection of our sky, so we're starting to pull the scene together a little bit. So what I want to do now is create a few more very simple basic materials that we can create as just a standard go-to as far as something that represents a metal, or a few different types of metal, and then I want to create a material that's really truly from scratch that has a texture to it. So the first, I want to make a material for some of the metal elements as well as the window frames. So I'm going to come down to the bottom left, add material. I'm going to just do a generic material. I'm going to first name it. I'm going to call this window frames. And so this is where we'll start to get into what all these settings are and how they work. So the first, and any generic, which is just your basic dumb gray material that comes in. If we look at the diffuse layer, this is going to control the color of the layer itself. So here it comes in at this generic ground, or medium gray rather. So I'm going to actually make this much darker. I want some nice, almost black window frames. So I'll go there. You can see this updates here. The generic reflection, if I drop down here, a few key things to note here. Mostly it's going to be the reflection color and the reflection glossiness. So the reflection color is black, which means it's no reflection. And if I change this all the way to white, you can see it's extremely high reflection. So if I look at my little sample here, it becomes this really almost like polished finish. And so this is where you have to start to trust your eye in understanding what materials actually look like. So if we think of like a painted aluminum window frame, we know that it is quite shiny, but it's maybe not as full gloss as we're seeing here. So I'm going to dial this back just a little bit so that we are getting some sheen on it, but not a full, this is almost like a car paint. And we know just by looking at windows that they're a little bit more muted in their glossiness. The other thing we can do is control the glossiness itself. And what that does is sort of blurs the edges. So keep an eye on this. Maybe it's easier to see it on the full reflection. Keep an eye on this little white spot, this shiny spot, and some of these reflection lines you're seeing in the sample. If I knock this down just to like 0.5, we'll say, and let that render, you can see it sort of blurred all those fine lines. So now it's feeling a little bit more, like a reflective metal or something, where it reflects light, but it doesn't. You can't look at it and see your face in it. You would just see a shadowiness or something that's either blocking light. And so this is maybe even a little bit too muted. This is almost looking like a rubber in its own way of its shininess, and not quite a exterior paint or a metal. So I'm going to move this back up to maybe like 0.8. Oops. And now we're starting to get somewhere in the middle. You can see make out some reflections, but it's not totally crisp. And we'll drop this down a little bit as well. And now we're starting to get something that feels a little bit more like a painted metal or like a plastic, and that kind of middle sheen to it. So again, the only two things I'm controlling here are the glossiness and the reflection color. The refraction I'm going to stay away from. That's more relevant to objects that are actually transparent. Because this is an opaque material right now, meaning we can't see through it at all, we don't need to worry about the refraction that it's creating. Opacity, again, we're not going to mess with that right now because we don't want it to be transparent in any way. Advanced options, again, none of these are going to be relevant for a lot of your basic dumb materials. We'll come to this when we're creating some new materials from scratch. I'm just going to minimize all of these so it's a little cleaner. There's some multipliers, again, we don't need to fuss with those right now. The material options are important. Again, this is where you can turn it where it's could be overridden or not. But the ID color is also important here as well. So this is what's going to output a material ID, which will be great for photoshopping later on. It should automatically randomly generate a new color per material as you create them. So this is this sort of light purple here. So we'll let that be, but if we wanted to change it, we could make it whatever we want. And then down here are the maps, and this is going to be extremely important, is the bump and displacement. And since I'm just making a metal, I don't want texture on it. It's going to be smooth, so I'm not going to add anything now, but we'll come back and make a material that adds that as well. So we'll call this good for our window frames. It's got a kind of plasticky or almost, you know, painted aluminum sheen to it. So I'm going to minimize that. I'm going to go to my window frames layer and make sure I attribute them to that. Click OK, and you should see they all get black now, so that's nice, clean, modern window mullions. And so the next material I want to make that'll sort of cover a lot of different options and methods is I want to make a wood siding, and what I want to do is put a wood siding on this wall right here. You know, it's something sort of like some nice lap that comes in and makes this porch feel nice and cozy. But I want to make it so that it's seamless, meaning that you can't ever tell where the wood repeats. And I want to have just wood is not a highly reflective material, but it does have some little bit of glowiness that's usually, you know, has to do with a stain or a poly coat that's put onto it. So there's a little bit of reflectivity, but not a lot. But there's definitely going to be a lot of texture. Obviously, wood's texture is going to be strong, but it's also going to have the texture in that there's going to be gaps between the boards. So we got to figure out how to reflect that. So to do all that, we have to start fresh in Photoshop if we're going to make this truly from scratch. So I'm going to open up Photoshop real quick. So once we have Photoshop open, this is where you start to truly make a material from scratch. And this is great because the reality is your project's you're going to have a vision of what material you want to use, and if you're lucky enough to find that available free online, or Vray has it available in their library, that's really great. But the odds are your specific custom material is going to not exist, and you're going to have to get a little creative about how to make it. So while there are a number of, if we actually just look here at the wood options that come with Vray, the wood and the laminate, you can see there's these wood floors, and there are some, you know, wood planks, right, that are okay, but the reality is I've tested these and they're quite repetitive and they're not all that strong. We can make a better one from scratch. So to do that, what I started with is this file that I just found online in a Google image search. I think I maybe found this on Pinterest or something, but it's a really simple, there we go. So this is a really like sort of wood decking, wood planks file. Again, I found this online. I didn't go out and take a picture of wood and make this seamless, but it is in fact seamless. So if you were to copy this up, it makes it look like it just continues. You can see there's some nice random joint spacing. So this is a very good starting point. It's also a fairly high res file. These are the kind of files that are going to make your model sing if you can track them down. But again, when I found this, it wasn't perfect. What I wanted, it wasn't quite the correct wood tone. So I come in here and I play with the, you know, maybe it's a little bit more wider. It's a little bit, try and play with that contrast. I'll come in here and make sure I got the hue of the wood just right. Maybe it's just a little bit more cherry or something like that. A little bit more desaturated, washed out. You can come in here and make sure you get exactly what you want first, and then I will just save that as a JPEG. So we'll save that as, let's call it our wood wall, or maybe it's a little more specific. exterior wood siding. Just saving that as a simple JPEG, nothing fancy there. But now what we want to do is we want to use this image to create a bump map. So we want to sort of extract the texture of this file and bring that out in a way that Vray understands it. So what Vray wants is a grayscale image where dark is going to be the most recessed and white will be the most proud. So to do that, all I have to do is to change the hue saturation to completely grayscale. But I want to, this is all pretty even. I mean, there are the black lines for the gaps, which is good, but I want to exaggerate that. This is going to be a really subtle reading for VA's standpoint. So in making a bump map out of an original JPEG, you're going to want something that's very high contrast. So I'm going to turn my contrast way up. I'm also going to turn my brightness way, way up. So now if you sort of step back and blur your eyes a little bit and you look at this, you can, just as if you would look at a wood wall, what would jump out are sort of the knots in the wood and the imperfections, as well as the seams, where the border themselves are actually quite smooth. So when you get something that looks more along these lines, this is what we're going for to create a bump map from an image. So what I'll do is I'll save that as well. I'll save it as exterior wood siding underscore bump to remind me that it's my bump map. Click save, click OK. So now I have two versions of the same seamless file that I started with. So let's go into Rhino and put those together and see if we can't make a nice wood siding. So I'll go back to my asset editor. I'm going to create a new material, a generic material, and I'm going to call it wood siding. And so if we go to our diffuse layer, remember before we were just changing the color of the material itself and it changed it here. Now I'm going to override that with an actual JPEG. But as Vray will refer to it as a bitmap. So, all I need to do is click here right on this little four square icon to the right. Once I click that, it's going to bring me into here. It's going to bring all these different types of sort of preset things. But all we're concerned with is adding a bitmap, meaning we're adding an external JPEG that we've created. So I will grab that exterior wood siding that I made and click open. You should see it here. It comes in. I'll click back. My material updates here as well. I can see it's now has this wood setting in here. So, okay, so that's a good for the main background, but now let's make sure all of the other aspects of this material match that. So reflection, like I said before, there is going to be just a little bit of reflection in wood. Not a whole lot, so I'm going to keep this very much, again, it's sort of just a grayscale. So I'm getting just a little bit of reflection there, but if just like the window frames we made, it wouldn't be as crisp. So I'm going to drop this down to like 0.7. So it's really, you can't make out anything, but we do get some variation. There is some, it will take on light a little bit, and we'll say that that's representing our finishing poly coat over the wood that gives it just a little bit of sheen. But more importantly, we need to give this some texture. So if we go all the way down here to maps, and we go to the bump and normal mapping, go to that drop down, first thing we're going to do is check it on, and the mode is the bump map, and this is sort of the amount of bump set at 1. We'll click the little 4 square here, we'll go to bitmap, and this is where we select our actual bump map that we made. Click open, we'll see it here, it's just grayscale. We'll go back, and this is sort of where the Vray preview sort of fails. You're not going to be able to see it that well, even if we do this wall close-up version of, there's a few different options for how you look at what you're creating. You're not going to totally see it, but this is where experience comes in on getting your settings to be just right. So 1's always a good place to start for the texture. I think it might be a little strong on this, but let's just render it at 1 for the amount here. So we have the wood bump map onto the the JPEG of the wood itself. Once this JPEG is in here, the fact that this is red doesn't matter. This is over. The fact that this is blue overrides any diffuse color we made here. We've made it a little bit of a blurry and a very subtle reflection on there. We don't have to worry about refraction or opacity because this is an opaque object. So let's minimize that. Let's go to our wall, which you can see is all this orange material here, which I have it labeled as wood walls. I'll click here and browse. Okay. Okay. And if I look at this in rendered view, you can see now my wood wall is in there. In the rendered view, you're going to get these things where it looks a little plasticky and over-exaggerated. That's just the graphics of the rendered view. That's not necessarily how it's going to render, so don't take that too seriously. But what you do see here is that my scale is already correct because it's sort of left over. But if your scale is not coming in correct and looks... So I'm going to go in here to my object and delete the mapping. And you can see not only is the scale incorrect, these boards look really big, it's not even in the right orientation. So typically what you're going to have to do is something that when you're bringing in a JPEG of an object that has an inherent scale is you're going to have to adjust it just like we did the grass and the concrete. It's just sort of more apparent when you have more defined, something that you recognize as a certain scale. So one way we can do this is, so while the Vray materials that were given, it told us how big to make the bounding box for the mapping widget. This material we just sort of found online. We don't know how big it is. One thing we could do is certainly count the boards here and decide that these are 6-inch boards or something like that, and then that way we can scale this so that we know that if these are 6 inches, what the total would be, and that would give us the same answer, sort of like the 2 meters that was given. The other thing we could do, which I tend to do in a lot of the stuff, is have it more as an eyeball, and also I can just make a little measuring cube, we'll say. So let's do that. So I'll just come in here on a different layer. I'm just going to make a little cube right here. This is a way to not get too technical and a sort of fast way to do it, especially if you don't know the exact scale of your thing. And I'm going to make it 6 inches by 6 inches by 6 inches. So there's my little 6-inch cube. We'll let that sit right there. We'll come back to this material here, and I'm going to do a box mapping. So I don't know how big this is supposed to be, so I'm just going to do something simple. I'm going to make my box mapping 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet. Enter. And so now we can see it's still going the wrong direction, and it may not even be the right scale. But it's at least a good starting point. So when I have this clicked, now if I go to my show mapping, there's that 10 foot by 10 foot by 10 foot box. And I can just manipulate and rotate and scale this thing until it visually looks like I want my object to be. So this is sort of the you know, if you don't know ahead of time what your JPEG scale is, this is a way to adjust it as you go to get it correct. So first things first, I want this to be horizontal. So I'm going to just rotate this whole box. I'm going to flip it on its side. So I'm going to right click and do my rotate 3D, which is going to ask me to make a rotation axis, and then click that sideways. So now immediately my object is in the right orientation, and I can just move my box over. And you can see when I move this box, it moves the material. So this is where I can really, if I wanted to show one specific part of the wood, I could even do that. I'm going to snap to bottom of my little test cube here. Get right on the bottom there. So I know that that's 6 inches tall. I know I want my boards to be 6 inches. So it looks like right now, just out of a rough starting point, they ended up at 4. So I'll scale 1D. I'll only deal with my height at the moment. And what I can do is just change the scale of this to get tall enough. I have to zoom out a little bit so I can see what I'm doing. And I can't quite see it, so what I'm going to do is, you can see this is scaling with me. If I zoom in here, if I mid-command go to my 4 viewports, here I can kind of adjust the height more carefully while still looking at what's happening. So now I can see right about there is great. Now I know my boards are about 6 inches. And then from there, if I know my board's height, I can just look at the material and start to see if the length is right. And what it looks like is it's a little bit squat. You can see these knots are getting a little bit too small. So I'm just going to, again, eyeball this, scale 1D, and just stretch those out a little bit till they feel like they're in proportion with the height. Because our JPEG we started with was not a perfect square, so it's going to be a little bit wider than it is tall. So we'll go right about there, looks good. And now we can see this was what was already pre-done, this is what we got to it. We're right about the same scale there. Maybe not exact, but it sort of looks believable. And now just to make sure everything is matching, I'm going to go to my wood walls layer, select objects, so now I have everything on that layer. And then I go to match mapping, I click the one that we just adjusted, and now everything matches that. And I know that my wood is going to be the same on all sides. So let's go ahead and render that and look at our output and see how we're doing, if we got our bump mapping to look realistic enough. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to zoom in here a little bit more, and I might even bump up the output settings a little bit so we can just see what's happening and make sure everything is rendering correctly. So I'm gonna bump my settings up to medium. It should be good enough to view this, and we'll let that render and see how we did. All right, so we can see here that this wood texture is coming out pretty well. If we just zoom in a little bit to see what we're getting to here, we start to get some nice wood texture that's happening throughout the image here. But we also just get a little bit of that nice reflection, and where you can really see that is up here where the light is hitting it. You're getting these little, almost like highlights in the wood, and that's what's happening by adding just that little bit of reflection there, that it picks it up just in like the brightest spots. But it's certainly not something that's reflecting the sky or reflecting these beams just enough to catch some of that shine from the sun. But then the bump itself is really giving that nice wood texture that feels very, very realistic. So I think that this is working out pretty well as a material built from scratch. And again, you can follow this logic with sort of any material. It's just a matter of making sure that you get the proper reflection and the bump scaled. And if this was too rough or not rough enough, what we would just do is just come into that material and just toy with this number here. And you wouldn't need to go much. You maybe go up to 1.2 or down to 0.8, and that usually sorts out it being too much. Sometimes I get textures that are feeling way too rough, I might jump into 0.5, but I usually don't have to do much than that. This worked out great, that keeping at 1 was getting you this nice realistic wood texture that we want there. And you can start to compare. So these areas that we haven't built yet are just sort of flat and nothing, and as soon as you start bringing in real textures on this area and really fine-tuning that, it's a significant difference from the generic white output, even with the correct lighting and shadows, to something that feels like a real material. So we'll leave it with there. We'll come into more advanced materials in a later tutorial, looking at emissives and aspects like that, so follow along. Thank you.